I would like to offer a very warm welcome to all of our guests to our inaugural Alumni Angles series. And I'm delighted to say that more than 400 people have registered to join us from all around the world, which acknowledges the global and diverse community that we have at Queen Mary. So at the moment we have alumni attending from almost 30 different countries, including Russia, Botswana, Mexico, and Denmark. So wherever you're coming from, we are so pleased that you can join us. My name is Rainbow Murray. I'm a professor in the School of Politics and International Relations, and I'm also the academic lead for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences. And today's event launches our new Alumni Angles series, which aims to showcase the talent amongst the Queen Mary alumni community through thought-provoking discussions and insights. And today's event is being held in celebration of LGBTQ History Month. And we are absolutely delighted to be joined today by Queen Mary alumna Jane Hill. Many of you will know Jane as presenter of BBC News at 1 on BBC One. But she is also an alumna from Queen Mary, where she graduated in 1991 with a BA in politics. And she then joined the BBC as a graduate and has worked in broadcast journalism for over 25 years. And she's covered many high-profile stories during that time, including the terrorist attack at London Bridge, the Grenfell Tower fire, US presidential elections, Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, and the disappearance of Madeleine McGann in Portugal. Outside the newsroom, Jane has worked for more than 10 years in the field of equality, diversity and inclusion, and is the supporter of several charities, including Diversity Role Models, the Albert Kennedy Trust, Parkinson's UK, Cancer Research UK, and Breast Cancer Now. And Jane was made an honorary fellow of Queen Mary in 2017. So we're really very pleased indeed that she's able to join us today. So Jane, my first question to you, which I imagine that many of our current undergraduates would be keen to know the answer to, that's a spectacular journey that you've had from an undergraduate in politics with us to your current position. So would you mind talking us through a little bit how you got to where you are and some of the ups and downs of your journey along the way?
Oh, Rainbow, thank you very much. Hello, good evening. Really, really lovely to be with you. Thank you so much for inviting me. That's brilliant that you have people registered from all over the world, by the way, as well. I think that's fantastic, isn't it? There aren't many upsides to the pandemic, are there? But I guess the fact that we can all come together and you can be anywhere in the world and log on to things like this is terrific. So that's lovely. Well, it's very kind of you to be so nice about my career. I don't know. I'm always, I can be sort of quite bashful about it all, really, because I've been lucky and I've done some great things, but I'm quite hard on myself actually as a person in all things. We might come to the personal side of it later, and I'm really quite hard on myself, and nothing is ever really good enough. And I feel like I've done okay, but I could have done better, and my wife Sarah, who's upstairs on another Zoom call, a work Zoom call, always says I shouldn't beat myself up in the way I do. But I had a brilliant time at Queen Mary. I loved it. And one of the best things to say about it is that I always say to everyone, you should I know it's super expensive to go to university these days, but I always say, please go, because one of the best things that happens is that you meet friends who will just travel through your life with you, and I am still friends with people today that I met in my first week probably at university, and it's just brilliant. It's lovely. Maybe we'll talk about that a bit later. So I did politics from 88 to 91, before some people on this call were probably alive, which is really scary. Just at that scary point in the newsroom where I look around at the researchers who are sort of all early mid-20s, and I like some old woman going, I used to be a researcher once, I used to do your job. I think, oh my God, I'm old enough to be your mother. I can't believe I've reached that point. But anyway, so 88 to 91 was my degree. And I was so super keen. I hope I wasn't too annoying in my teenage years, but I was so super keen to work in radio, actually. All I ever wanted to do was work in radio, that I started working in BBC local radio when I was still at school, actually. So when I was 17, I started working at BBC Radio Sussex, as it was called then. It's had a few name changes over the years. That's based in Brighton, just because I grew up in Sussex, and it really started from there. And another thing I always say to people is, if you want to get into journalism, I think local radio is a completely brilliant place to do that, because you can learn a little bit of everything. You can learn what you're good at, what you're bad at, what you like, what you don't like. And historically, local radio has always been under-resourced, is still under-resourced. And so if you turn up with a degree of enthusiasm and a willingness to learn, and you're not scared to just do any old job, you know, it could be something very highfalutin or it really could not, you can learn so much, and it's just brilliant. So by the time I came to Queen Mary, I was sort of relatively experienced in radio. I knew quite a lot. I could edit tape. I knew quite a lot about how things worked. And then every academic holiday, I would go back and I would do a little bit more at the radio station. So I had quite a long association with Radio Sussex over quite a few years. And then after my degree, so I finished June 91, and and one other brilliant thing happened that year, which was also, I have to say, thanks to the politics department at Queen Mary, because I got onto a scheme which I think still runs, or something very similar to it, and it's an internship scheme run by the English Speaking Union, an educational charity, I guess you would describe it as. And I don't think I would have known about this scheme particularly. And one of my politics tutors knew about it, or had a flyer or something, and said, "Oh, Jane, you should apply for this, it'd be brilliant." I don't know why I said that, because he didn't talk like that. But anyway, he said, "You should go for it and you should apply." And I didn't know a huge amount. And I certainly, I'm afraid, hadn't heard of the English Speaking Union. And it is the most brilliant scheme. And they take, or certainly how it worked back then, they took 20 undergraduates a year from all over the UK. They tried to gender balance it broadly. I think we might have had maybe 12 men and 8 women, I think, on my year. And fill in a form, go for an interview, and somehow I got through. It was amazing. I don't know what I said, but obviously the fact that I was studying politics helped. And they sent you to work on Capitol Hill, and I had an internship on Capitol Hill before I think really British people knew what an internship was. I mean, I kind of even had to find out what that meant, and that's a very common thing in the States, isn't it? But I always think people in Britain didn't really know what an internship was until we heard about an intern called Monica Lewinsky, and then everyone went, "Oh, what's this internship thing?" So I was pre-Monica Lewinsky, and yeah, so I ended up spending 5 months in Washington DC, which is just what an amazing experience. At the age of, I was just 22, I just turned 22. And then after that, came back into Old Broadcasting House, that beautiful building in central London, and did various jobs in BBC Radio. I guess the start was local radio, really, but then I did various jobs, including, for example, I was there at the start of the launch of Radio 5 Live. So that launched in March 94, and I was one of the original team that started 5 Live. I mean, obviously I was very junior, I was a researcher, but that was brilliant. And it sort of went from there, and I worked in radio for quite a few years, really, until I could see which way the wind was blowing in news at the time. And there was a move back in those days, so long ago. It was you kind of either did just radio or just telly. That's kind of how news worked. Maybe it feels, I guess, pretty old-fashioned to think of it now like that, but that's how it was. And when John Burt was Director General, he brought in by media, i.e., if you're a journalist, you should know how to do both. And that was actually considered quite controversial internally, but I was still very mid-20s probably when that came in, maybe early 20s. And I just thought, oh, do you know what? I can see which way the wind is blowing here. And if I want to have any kind of career of any duration, it sounds to me like I'm going to need to know how to do this TV thing. So I managed to get onto an internal BBC News trainee scheme, which I did have to really talk my way onto quite hard, actually, because it was designed for people with not a huge amount of experience. And by that stage, I was really quite experienced in radio, and I was working on a national radio station, and they were a bit like, well, why should we take you? But anyway, I obviously managed to convince them that while for my age, I knew a reasonable amount about radio, I knew absolutely diddly squat about telly. And I got onto the scheme and learnt TV that way, and thought I would just do work in regional television for a couple of years, and that would be it. And I would go back to radio, and that was always my plan, to do lots and lots of radio. And anyway, one thing led to another. I'll stop there because this is a very long answer. And one thing led to another, and 300 years later, I'm still in telly. I'm not sure how that happened. We might talk more about how that happened, but yeah, so I'm still there. I thought by this stage I'd be on Radio 4, but that hasn't happened.
How did you make the jump though from researcher to broadcaster? Who decided to put you in front of the microphone rather than on the other side?
Oh, that's a really good question, actually. That's so funny. I'd never get asked that. That's really interesting. So what happened? The internal BBC training scheme that I mentioned was regional, as in you were attached to one particular BBC region, which in my case happened to be BBC South, which is headquarters in Southampton. That's simply where I went because I knew that patch because I'd grown up in Sussex. So what that meant was your local TV experience was in Southampton, and then you also did stints in all the local associated radio stations. So that would have been Sussex, Solent, Berkshire, all of that. And I think, again, partly in local radio, again, it comes back to the thing of quite often people muck in and do a bit of everything. Although I was really a producer, really, I wasn't, but I also did some reporting in local radio. And then when I went to the TV side of things in Southampton, your job was quite generic. So when you were in the newsroom, so you were working on the 6:30 BBC One regional programme. And again, your rota was such that you did a bit of everything. So you, some days would just be, some days you would be producing, and some days you would be out on the road reporting. So I did a bit of everything. And I suppose from doing the reporting side of it, some reporters then got asked to do those hideously very, very early morning regional bulletins that go into BBC Breakfast. And I guess now I think about it, I can think of him now, and it would have been the man in overall charge of news in Southampton who would have said, right, start doing these early morning bulletins. And I mean, God knows how I coped with it, because I am so rubbish in the mornings. I'm much more of a later night person. I mean, I hate early alarm calls with a passion. But anyway, I was young, it was fine. I can't do it now, but in your 20s, you can do anything, can't you? And so I would have done those bulletins. And then from doing those bulletins and the lunchtime bulletin, obviously at some point, the main presenter would have gone on leave, because they do. And he obviously said, have a go at doing the main programme. But I actually only presented the main programme probably 10 times, actually. So I was much more of a producer / reporter. And but then while I was at South Today, so this would be 1997, that's when the BBC announced it was creating a 24-hour rolling news channel. And so then it all went from there, really. So I put in a show reel to that, genuinely thinking I would get some freelance shifts out of it. And that partly comes back to the fact that because I'd been to London University, all my friends were in London, my whole life was in London. I enjoyed my job in Southampton, but my life, my friends were in the capital, and I really, really missed them. And I thought, oh, if I get some freelance shifts on this new channel they're starting up, it'd be great, because I can pop up at weekends, earn some extra money on some freelance shifts, see my friends, you know, have a social life again with them. And that was the plan. And the show reel meant I got a screen test. This feels so old fashioned now. Do we even do screen tests anymore? I don't think we do. I got a screen test, and I mean, they practically offered me a job on the spot, actually, there and then, for that new channel. I was really surprised how enthusiastic they were. I thought I'd be good enough to get some freelance shifts. I did think that, but I didn't expect them to say, right, come on board. I mean, and actually at the time, I thought I was a little bit too young, because I was very late 20s, but I wasn't yet 30. And I thought that was too young, actually, to be a full-time presenter. But as I said, my whole life was in London. I was desperate to come back to London. And because I'd been at the launch of 5 Live and knew how much fun it was to be part of a brand new service and something starting that's new, I just thought it would be that same experience all over again. And I do love being part of a team. I love being part of a team. And I thought that would just be another lovely experience. And I wanted that experience too. So even though I felt I was too young in my heart of hearts, there was no way I was going to say no, because it just ticked so many boxes. And I was literally the most junior presenter on the channel. Don't get me wrong. They said, have a job, Jane, but you're on the overnights. So, I mean, you know, I wasn't doing anything illustrious, but that's also a good thing, really, because I would have been too young to just be dumped on immediately onto a sort of big mainstream daytime rolling news channel. You know, I needed to learn a lot. So actually now I look back and I think it absolutely happened the right way. Although again, I think, oh God, how did I survive 2 years of night shifts? But you do, again, youth.
Thank you. So actually having a London anchoring from your university days paid off because it drew you back to the big time in a way.
Isn't that funny? I know it. Yes. And I suppose also that just for whatever reason, in fact, almost all the friends I made at Queen Mary and in my halls, I stayed in International Hall in central London, and which I know is still there because I go to the little cinema opposite it. And big shout out if there's anyone watching who was at IH. And I loved it. International Hall was a brilliant place to live. And a lot of my friends are from there, from those days. And weirdly, very few people actually left London after our degree. That's interesting, isn't it? One friend went to Bristol for a year and did a master's and things like that. But essentially, people all sort of gravitated back to the capital, rightly or wrongly. It's just the way it worked out. Certainly among my friendship group, and most of us are still here, actually, one way or another.
All of my friendship group from university ended up in London, which is funny because I went to the University of Manchester, but it certainly has its appeal. So you've reported on some really major breaking stories. What's it like to be on the cutting edge of something that you know is really important, but you don't know how it's going to pan out while you're reporting it?
Yeah, another good question. I think I'm not very good at selling myself, and I'm not, that's been a failing throughout my career, really. But the one thing, in fact, I do always have confidence in saying is I do appear to have, most of the time, some strange ability to stay very, very calm on the surface, even if everything else is just going mental behind the scenes. Tempers are frayed a little bit during the pandemic, but that's another story. But broadly, for some reason I couldn't begin to explain, I can stay very calm when something quite major is going on. And obviously we wear earpieces and maybe someone's yelling in your ear and maybe they don't mean to, but if a big story breaks, you can feel the kind of atmosphere rise in the newsroom. It suddenly gets a bit noisier, people start running around. I mean, this is all pre-pandemic, we're obviously behaving slightly differently at the moment, but broadly speaking. So things like that 99 times out of 100 don't worry me, and I do have an ability to just, it's the swan thing, isn't it? The swan gliding along and underneath the legs are paddling furiously. I'm very much like that, and I can do that, and I'm quite good at that, and I don't really know why, but I've always been able to do it. I mean, like I said about starting on night shifts, you get better and better the more you do at it. I wasn't, I didn't come out the womb being able to do that, but many years of practice and you can do it. And I hope as well that I hope I'm good at context. I hope I'm good at not getting hysterical or over dramatic. For example, if a bomb goes off, God forbid, or those sort of stories. I hope I keep a lid on the drama until we really know the facts. I deliberately chose to work for the BBC because I liked its style and tone and approach, and I think I'm quite BBC in a good way, as in, I don't want to tell an audience that something has happened until we absolutely 100% know for sure that that's the case. in a way that if you work for other people, you've got a bit more latitude, and that's fine. You know, that's their prerogative, but that wasn't for me. And I would like to, I don't want to be slow at things. I don't, you know, you break the story when it breaks, but equally context is important, and even more so now, more than ever really, with social media, when everything can get whipped up, and then, you know, half an hour later you discover it's all hokum and people have just got hysterical, but it's whipped up a steam, you know, head of steam on Twitter or something. So I hope I'm good at giving context, only giving the facts as we know them, not getting over dramatic, I hope. And I'm very, very interested in people and people's reactions. I'm more interested in the impact that something terrible, unfortunately, I feel like I'm only describing terrible stories, but you know what I mean. I'm interested in how it impacts on real people, as I always say, real people. I went to Cumbria after the Raoul Moat shootings. Of course, I'm not going to remember what year that was, but Raoul Moat, who shot several people in Cumbria, blinded a policeman. And I remember being there and in the days after, and it was really just normal people in the town that I wanted to talk to and felt that I could be most useful talking to. And I remember doing an interview with a man who had been confronted by Raoul Moat on the day in a car, had his gun, and but he didn't really realize at the time what his encounter was. He was just going about his business in the normal way, and went home, turned on the TV, realized what was happening, that there was a man out shooting, and had delayed shock, really, because he realized, to do with where he was when, that he had come face to face with Moat. He realized subsequently, through watching the TV footage, that he had come face to face with Moat, and that their two cars were parked at a red light together, and Moat had stared over and really stared at him in his car. And poor man had, I mean, thank God he was fine, he was alive, but he had unbelievable shock that he, over time, it sunk in with him that could have been me. You know, he was randomly shooting people and he could have shot me, and he stared at me as I was behind the wheel of my car, and he was absolutely traumatized. And it was a really upsetting interview to do, but equally I like to feel that that's the sort of thing I can do fairly well. And I'm sympathetic, but and very aware that someone standing in front of you is clearly traumatized. But by the same token, I knew I was doing his story justice because I wasn't forcing him to talk in any way. I didn't make him talk any longer than he wanted to. He actively wanted to talk, and I had said before, "Are you sure this is live television, etc., etc.?" And that was clearly his way of dealing with a traumatic experience, and he actively wanted to discuss it on air. That was really therapeutic for him, you could tell. And that's why he said yes to the interview. And there were other people who didn't want to talk about what they'd seen, and that's fine. And I would not push someone to do a traumatic interview just because that would make us, you know, just because that would be an extra feather in our cap. I mean, I don't think that would be a feather in my cap to get someone on air who's distressed and doesn't want to talk. And I would take that responsibility to a member of the public. I take that very, very seriously. And I hope in cases like that, sorry, another very long answer, Rainbow, but in cases like that, I hope that I do those sort of stories justice, and that I do people justice, because they don't ask for those events to be brought into their town. They don't ask then for people like me and all the camera crews to turn up in their town, and you have to treat people with respect and understand that they might be in a really bad way. And at least I can feel proud of myself, within myself, that I did the right thing and I asked the right questions, but I didn't push it with someone who was clearly desperately upset. And so those sort of stories are, I don't take pleasure in a horrible story at all. I'm not that kind of journalist in the slightest, but when a story has to be told, you can still do it well and do it responsibly. And I hope I do that. And I would also cite, for example, Hurricane Katrina, which you mentioned, where obviously, my God, I was interviewing people who'd lost everything. And again, it's about treating them with some sensitivity. And again, I was encountering people who wanted to talk because they were so traumatized, they actually wanted the world in that case to see. They felt they'd been neglected by their government, and that the levies had been allowed to break and destroy their homes, and they wanted, especially when you say you're from the BBC, they wanted to tell their story. But equally, some of them were desperately upset and had lost every possession. And it's about doing right by people in difficult circumstances, I think.
Thank you, and please don't apologise for the answers you're giving. They're fascinating. And to go back to your swan analogy, it really is interesting to understand the paddling that's going on underneath the surface, because all that we see as consumers of the news is the very smooth gliding, and it's interesting to know the human responses and interactions that go on underneath that. Now, if you'll allow me, because it's LGBTQ History Month, I would like to ask you a question. You came out to the world in 2009, which many people applauded you for. What prompted you to do so at that moment?
So this is always really interesting. I hesitate to correct what you say, but there's one thing. I assume that this fact is on Wikipedia. I have never looked myself up on Wikipedia, genuinely. But it always gets said to me, "Ah, yes, Jane, of course, you came out in the BBC in-house magazine." Was that 2009? That probably was, wasn't it? I think it was 2009. And it drives me a bit potty because, and you haven't done anything that 1,000 people haven't done before you. But it sort of got out there that the reason I don't like that phrase is "you came out in the in-house magazine" is because it makes it sound as if I deliberately took a stand and I sort of phoned up the editor of Ariel, which is what the in-house magazine is called, and said, "Right, I need to come out. You've got to write this article about me." And that is just absolute hokum. And how it emerged, the reason it irritates me, I guess, is that how it emerged is that I did an interview for the Christmas issue that year, which they asked me to do, nothing to do with me approaching them. And as part of that interview, a tiny, like 1% of that whole interview talked about the fact that I lived with Sarah in London with our dog. Nothing more exciting than that. And that has sort of become an urban myth that I therefore made a deliberate attempt to sort of unveil this to the world in our in-house publication. And it wasn't like that at all. It was that they asked me, because it was the Christmas issue, they had a regular feature about, it was called A Day in the Life. So bearing in mind how big the BBC is, they would just pick someone from all different parts of the BBC for each edition. So it could be a cameraman on EastEnders one week and a makeup artist another week. And so they thought, oh, let's do an article about what it's like to work on Christmas Day, because it's December. And I've done so many Christmas days, sadly, in my life. And I was doing the bulletins on BBC One that Christmas Day. So they said, "Can you talk to us about what the newsroom's like on Christmas Day?" And honestly, Rainbow, 99% of the interview was about the BBC on Christmas Day. I'm not joking. But because this was a regular formula feature, on the side of the page, they had like a little CV box. So it would have said, started in local radio, went to Queen Mary, read politics, and then it would have a little thing about, literally like hobbies and personal life. So of course, mine said lives with Sarah and her border collie. And so that has gone down in history as me coming out. And at the time, everyone in the newsroom knew anyway, so it certainly wasn't a revelation to anyone that I worked with in any way, shape or form. I suppose there were people in other parts of the BBC that perhaps didn't know, because why would they know anything about me any more than I would know about them? But equally, I wasn't bothered about that. But because this was Christmas, and we all know news is context, and there's always a dead period in news between Christmas and New Year, and about 10 days later in that Christmas New Year period, a tabloid paper picked up on it, obviously saw it, or someone pointed it out to them or something, and they thought, oh, whoopee-doo, quiet news period, we'll write a whole article about a BBC news presenter coming out. So it has gone down as an urban myth. And so I suppose it irritates me because my beloved co-presenter at the time, Matthew, if he'd done that interview, his little box would have said, married to Jackie with children, and it would have gone utterly unremarkable and unnoticed in that sense. Equally, I don't mind that it happened. I mean, that's completely fine. I was completely fine with all of it by then, but it had been a long journey. So yeah, so that's sort of how it started, but it just gets written up everywhere I go. I've been introduced on stages and panels and things as, oh, you came out in the In-House magazine. It's like, ah. But I understand totally why you ask it. And obviously, had I not I mean, the flip side of that is, had I wanted to remain private or secret about it, or whatever word you want to use at that stage, then I either could have said no to the interview, or I suppose I could have asked them not to fill in that little bit and just leave that bit blank. But that would have been a dreadful thing to do, really, wouldn't it? I mean, that's not on at all. So yeah, so it all went from there, really. And then hilariously, we then had we lived in a flat in those days, and we then had some woman from the Mirror or the Sunday Mirror or someone literally ringing the doorbell of the flat, literally, and Sarah had to go down, and I literally heard this. I mean, she looked about 19 or 20. I was kind of peering, but I didn't want to go and say hello because it was just all too much at that stage. And she literally stood on the doorstep and said to Sarah, would Jane like to give us her side of the story? I actually heard her say that, and I thought, which side of which story is that exactly? I mean, don't get me wrong, she was perfectly nice. She was very nice. She was very polite. But I just thought that was a line that people said in films. You know, it's like, really, do people actually say that? And Sarah was very polite to her, and it was all very civilized and British and middle class, and she went on her way. But I just thought, I literally don't know what you want me to say, other than, yes, it's true. I mean, what else do you want? And then a few days later, there was some terrible, terrible photo of us taken. So they'd sent some snappers out to take a picture of us walking our dog, which is quite unimaginative, except it was a really cold winter. And I really, really feel the cold as well. So I'm always bundled up like Michelin woman. And it was just this it was such a bad photo. Even friends of mine texted me to tell me what a bad photo it was. I was like, thanks. I've probably gone off piste. You probably have something far more serious you'd like to ask me about at all.
No, I mean, I was just thinking it's a real reflection of heteronormativity, that people generally just assume you're straight unless you happen to mention that you're not, and then when you happen to mention that you're not, it's a story. When, as you point out, it wasn't a story. It was just a detail of your life that people found uncommon and therefore fixated upon in a way that they wouldn't have done had you mentioned that you lived with John.
Yes.
So I want to ask you generally, you mentioned that everybody in the newsroom already knew. Have you generally found the culture at the BBC to be inclusive, and not just on matters of sexual orientation, but more broadly on matters of diversity? Because I know this is something that you've done quite a lot of work on.
Like every organisation, it's a work in progress. In terms of my personal experience, I mean, gosh, we've got to remember, I mean, there's probably, you know, quite young people listening to this call who probably wouldn't even understand some of the things I would try and explain about what it was like back in the day and how hard it was to come out, just because I'm 51, so I grew up against a backdrop of AIDS and Section 28 and that whole period that everyone's probably been watching in It's a Sin, you know, the fabulous Russell T Davies series. Oh, I wish that had been on the BBC, but anyway, it was still brilliant, and I'm glad he made it. And that was the backdrop against which I grew up. So that was one of the contributory factors that meant I really struggled with coming to terms with who I was. So in terms of how they reacted to me personally, first of all, it was mainly fine. But you know, this was quite a few, what was this, 20 years, not quite 20 years ago, but 15, 16 years ago, I guess. And even 15, 16 years ago, this country was very different and people were fine. And certainly there was no, you know, malice or deliberate hostility or anything like that. But I am under no illusions that I was absolutely a subject of gossip. An element of, oh, she doesn't look like a lesbian, does she? Because obviously there are, as you know, stereotypes around what a lesbian looks like. Let's not go down that rabbit hole. So I was very conscious that there were those sort of mutterings, and most of it's not said in a malicious way. It's a kind of jokey, tee-hee, oh gosh, isn't that funny? Oh, I didn't think they looked like that. You know, it's fairly puerile. They don't think they're being horrible. They're not trying to be horrible. There's a bit of that. And also that then takes us on to a subject I endlessly find myself discussing, which is, why are there lots and lots of gay men in public life but so few gay women? So that's another issue. You are simply a topic of more gossip because there are fewer of you, far fewer of you. And they would gossip about a gay man as well, but it wouldn't last very long, because sort of they're much more ten a penny in a way that gay women are not, for reasons I still don't understand and maybe we'll discuss later. So in terms of more broadly, in terms of the corporation more broadly, I mean, we're trying all the time. BBC is trying all the time, like every organization is, like every society is. You know, 20,000 people work for the BBC, so we are a reflection of society like any big company or institution. So there are, you know, every shade of grey, every shade of opinion, because we represent everyone, and you know, you're going to get people who are not wanting to be quite as inclusive as others. Broadly, of course, it is a good, welcoming environment to work in, broadly. There is always more that can be done, particularly, and I've talked about this before, particularly around LGBTQ plus representation, which, you know, I think is still a work in progress. Again, far more men than women. Gosh, I say that every time. Sorry, you were asking sort of broadly about how inclusive is it. I mean, it's trying really hard. Well, one of the things that's tricky for me, I suppose, to answer it, is that I have always worked in news and current affairs. So I don't know what it's like to work in other areas of the BBC, which can be quite separate. And in fact, I've got a very good friend who works at Radio 2, for example, and she and I discuss this quite a lot, because I am very conscious of, you know, working in a very, very heterosexual environment in TV news. I work with lovely people, fabulous. I love the people I work with. It's not a reflection, that's not a bad thing, but it is a statement of fact that I work in a very heterosexual environment and always have done. And my friend at Radio 2 finds that really interesting. And we kind of almost sort of sometimes don't quite understand the other's experience in that professional experience, because she would say, I work somewhere where there are so many gay people, you know, and I cannot imagine my working life being like that. I go, oh my God, you're so lucky, you're so brilliant. I did do 1 week in my life at Radio 2 where I stood in for Jeremy Vine. It was about 10 years ago, and I did a week, and it was, I always say, it was literally one of the best weeks of my life, without a shadow of a doubt. It was just glorious. I mean, I love radio anyway, as we were saying at the beginning, so that was a bonus. And it's the most fun program to do. It's entertaining, and you get to talk to people and talk about all the day's events, but then you also get to play a track by Kylie. I mean, what's not to like? It's just the best job in the world, and I had so much fun. And that was quite an eye-opener, even though that was 10 years ago, because I never worked in that sort of atmosphere before. I hadn't, that sort of fun atmosphere that I experienced for that one single week at Radio 2, I associate with actually all the diversity work that I do and the big charity fundraisers that I go to raise money for various causes, all that sort of thing. That for me was more of the atmosphere. And I thought, wow, some people actually work in this atmosphere. That's amazing. So that's, again, a long-winded way of saying that different parts of the BBC are different. And I did have that conversation once with someone very senior. Sadly, I don't knock around with very senior people at the BBC very often, but a few years ago I did have a conversation with someone really quite senior about I ended up somehow explaining to her that the TV newsroom was really heterosexual. I don't even know what we were talking about, but anyway, I did, and she was really genuinely very surprised. And she didn't work in news, she worked somewhere else, and she said, that's so weird, Jane, because she said, I feel like I work, this was a heterosexual female as it happened, but she said, I feel like I work in an area with quite a lot of gay people, because well, I won't tell you who said this to me, but she said, well, entertainment is full of gay men and documentaries is full of gay women. And I went, oh, is it? Okay. And so that kind of is my sole experience of other parts of the BBC. And I just sort of had to take her word for it. And we were just comparing how your experience of your employment and your life, and in my case, your whole career, can be so different to someone who works actually for the same company, but just in an entirely different field. So that's quite interesting. So I hesitate. I don't ever feel I can speak for the whole BBC, because I can't, because I only have experience of one section of it. So we're getting there, we're getting better, but you know, we like so many corporations, we always need to do better in our recruitment. I think the socio-economic background issue is very live, isn't it? And so it should be. And you know, the BBC is no better or worse than lots of other employers when it comes to trying to recruit truly diverse candidates from all walks of life. I mean, that is actually quite a challenge, and I know it's something that Tim Davie, who's still quite new as DG, has been talking about recently, and all power to him for raising it, because it has to be done.
There have also been a few talking points, particularly relating to women in the BBC. So this is something you might empathise with. You've mentioned a few times today, oh, this was such a long time ago, I'm 51. But there's been a number of accusations levelled at the BBC that they shelve women after a certain age, that men can sort of go on presenting indefinitely, but after a certain period of time, women have complained that they've been shelved in favour of a younger model. Countryfile was a prominent example of that. We've also seen a number of pay discrimination cases. I'm thinking Samira Ahmed or Carrie Gracie, who's now quit the BBC. So is this something that you think the BBC has now got a handle on, or do you think these are still real equalities issues that are ongoing?
I mean, they're two quite distinct questions. I understand why you put them together. Equal pay is one thing. The representation side of it, I completely get what you're saying. When I joined the BBC, I joked about how I thought I'd be in Radio 4 by now, and I love Radio 4, and that would be brilliant. But when I joined, I genuinely thought that by the time I was about 40, whether I wanted to or not, I would be sort of moved off into radio, because you didn't see older women on screen. And I tell you, that is the one thing that, thank the Lord, has really, it's probably the most dramatic change I've seen inside the Beeb, or indeed probably in telly generally, actually, although I haven't worked for other TV stations, but it is the one big fundamental thing that has got better in the time that I have been there, which is brilliant. And as it should be, because we still talk about, so-and-so is 55, it's quite hard to explain what I mean without giving the ages of all my female co-presenters. But the point is, there's still a disparity, but it's a lot better than it was. I genuinely thought I would be put on radio, and because I genuinely love radio so much, and always have, and would love to end up on radio anyway, I was actually quite relaxed about that, even though I knew it was for a bad reason, because men are allowed to carry on and get fat and get grey hair and all the rest of it, and all the things that women aren't allowed to do. Because I so love radio, I thought, oh God, I'm fine with that. I'm genuinely fine with that. And of course, hilariously, it hasn't happened. So that has got better. I remember in my youth, it's genuinely in my 20s, I'm not going to name them again, but I can think of female correspondents, reporters who were very good. And in my 20s, probably even in my 30s, who sort of get eased out eventually, or get commented on for the fact that their hair's going grey, or whatever, all the things that we know about, and that did used to happen. And I doubt very much that was only a BBC thing. I would imagine that happened in other broadcasters too, and actually it was one area where the States was way ahead of Britain in that regard. I spent a lot of time in America over the years, and I've got friends there, and from quite a young age, I was always really struck that the big American TV networks always had some women who were really quite a lot older than you would ever see on British TV, and that's interesting. So that is finally changing, isn't it? Which is a good thing. Anne Robinson is the new host of Countdown. Wow. But again, that's still, again, at her, I don't know exactly how old she is, but she's 70, I think. And again, we comment on that and I laugh about that, and all power to her, that's great. But that's still commented on as, oh, Anne Robinson's going to do Countdown, whereas we can all name lots and lots of men who have carried on broadcasting and still do carry on broadcasting, not just where I work, into their 70s. Totally. I mean, there's lots and lots of them, whereas we've just got Anne Robinson doing Countdown. In fact, that's not even a BBC programme. I've just realised. As ever, I have lost my train of thought on that one because I was doing my flight of fancy about older women. But it's got better. It's got a lot better. And that, I think, can only be a good thing. And especially in news, for goodness sake, actually, because authority, experience, all the things I talked about around needing to give context to stories, call me old-fashioned, but I think that comes, you get better and better at that with age, don't you? I think.
You build up gravitas.
Yeah. Oh. And just like I said, I was too young to be a full-time presenter at the age of 29, and I fully acknowledge that. And actually, would they even do that today? That would be an interesting question. Would they give a full-time presenter job to someone who was that young? In rolling news, where you are dealing with the whole of life's events, you know, I don't know whether they would, actually. They probably shouldn't have done back then, but they did, because all the women were much younger than the men then.
Well, I'm glad that they did then. I'm glad that you're not being farmed out now. We're delighted to still have you on television screens, and long may that last. Now, I mentioned that February is LGBTQ+ History Month, and there is one other thing going on this February that I would like to give a mention to, which is that Queen Mary has a university boob team who are raising money for a charity called Copperfield.
Oh, yeah, Copperfield, yes.
Copperfield are a charity that encourages people to do self-examinations to make sure that they detect breast cancer early, because obviously the earlier you're diagnosed, the greater the chance of survival. And so I'm giving a shout out to the University Boob team, who are doing a lot of fundraising this month. And I know that this is a story that affects you personally. I wondered if you would like to say anything about that.
Well, brilliant. I didn't know that you were working with that charity, but that's fantastic. And yes, I mean, you can't say it often enough. Just check yourselves, ladies, just check yourselves. I was diagnosed with breast cancer in October 2018. Now, how can I give you a short version of this story? I mean, I'm doing really well now, so that's all good. I'm very open about it. I had a mastectomy and radiotherapy. I was amazingly, well, not amazingly, I was quite philosophical about it all when it happened. I wasn't surprised at all on the day they told me, so I wasn't in shock. I wasn't in floods of tears. I thought it probably was that, and so I was pretty calm actually on that day. I felt a lump, and I went to my GP and did all the things you're meant to do. It took a long time to get a diagnosis, longer than it should under the NHS guidelines. That's partly, it transpires, is because my breast cancer was lobular, and I'll try not to go into too much detail because this is fascinating to anyone who's been through it, but less fascinating to those who haven't. But there are two types of breast cancer. I didn't know this at the time, and one is most people get something called ductal. 12% of people get the one I had, which is lobular, and basically the defining characteristic of lobular, it is much, much, much harder to find. So even though the tumor was big, it didn't show up on a mammogram because lobular tumors often don't. I'll try to truncate what is obviously a very long story. So it took an MRI basically to find it, but they did find it, they got rid of it, it's all gone. And in fact, what was the date today? On the 1st of March, I will be officially 2 years clear, which is lovely because they count it from the end of your treatment. So building up to the 1st of March, and the consultant always says the first 2 years are the scariest, Jane. So that 1st of March is a big red letter day in this house. Yeah, and I'm very open about talking about it, actually, a bit like my sexuality, which I now feel very strongly obviously about talking about because there are so few gay women in public life. I also do talk quite openly about breast cancer and always very happy to talk to people, or I don't mean give advice in any medical sense. I have no particular medical knowledge other than when I was diagnosed, particularly given the job I do. I mean, I did so much research, you can imagine, and within a fortnight I sort of could have taken an A-level in breast cancer, you know, and there's lots I could tell you now and lots that I've discovered. But yes, I'm doing well, but you know, you have to be careful for 5 years, and well, be very careful really, and keep checking the remaining one and make sure there's nothing there. And I mean, I do use black humor about it a lot, and I feel very lucky that I'm genuinely quite philosophical about it. 1 in 7 women in the UK gets breast cancer at some point in their lives. I mean, it's a terrifying stat really, but I think, well, 1 in 7 is, and the other thing actually, that's the wonderful thing about women and how supportive they can be when the chips are down, I think actually, is that when I was diagnosed, well, A, because it's so prevalent, you instantly can think of lots of people you know who've had it. So I instantly thought, oh, I'll ring so-and-so, I'll text so-and-so. There are instantly people you can talk to, which is sad because that shows you how many women go through it, but equally it's brilliant because there's lots of people to talk to. And also, oh my God, what was my second point? Anyway, I had lots of people to talk to, and I feel very philosophical, and I try not to think about it every day. There are days where you think about it, and there are days where you don't think about it at all. So the human mind is an amazing thing. But the one that well, my consultant is wonderful and said lots of very sage things, but one of the many sage things she said to me was that, because I told her immediately, I said, look, I'm sorry, I am a journalist, so I'm going to ask you 20 questions now, and I'm going to go away and do a lot of research. And she laughed and she said, oh, I've dealt with plenty of journalists, Jane, don't worry. But she said, talk to whoever you like, but please remember that every single case is different. You can't just say, oh, but so-and-so had the same size tumor as me, therefore it's not like that. And she was so right. She was so right. There are so many differences. And, you know, I was actually very lucky because although I had to have a mastectomy, I was convinced I was going to have chemo because the tumor was big. And for various reasons, I didn't have to. And actually, the day I cried the most was the day they told me I didn't have to have chemo, because I was so convinced I was going to have it. I suppose I just convinced myself so that I wouldn't be disappointed when they told me I had to. I honestly felt like I had dodged such a big bullet by not having it. So my heart, you know, I have enormous sympathy and empathy for women who've had what I've had, but have also had to have chemo, because that is a whole other experience, and I know from talking to people. So I don't mean to sound glib about it, and I don't mean to underestimate what it can do to families and relationships. And like my consultant says, every case is different, and everyone's family setup is different. Oh God, you see, you started me now. You will have to shut me up on this topic because I could talk forever. But just to give you like one final example for you know, I have a dog, but I don't have children, and I do have a border collie, so it's a bit like having a toddler. But you know, in all seriousness, I don't have children, and you know, when you have a mastectomy, obviously you have to be super careful on that side for quite a long time. And for the first 2 weeks, they literally say you cannot even lift a kettle. Jane, do not even lift a kettle. You know, you're so fragile there. But I'm lucky. I didn't have to look after. I mean, I couldn't walk the dog. Obviously, you couldn't have her pull you along. But I thought, wow, if I had been walking around, you know, you walk around your house with your drain in for the first week and all that sort of thing. And I thought, wow, I can get better and I can recover because I'm lucky. I only have to think about me. I don't have to go to work. I just look after myself. If I need to sleep, I sleep. I was really good about that. If I felt tired, I went straight to bed. And I thought, wow, if I had 2 little children running around who needed looking after, what if I was a single parent with 2 kids, for example, and I had to do all that? And the consultant had said, but you can't even lift a kettle, and you really can't. I mean, that would be shattering. So I mean, so much harder than anything I ever had to deal with. So, you know, my circumstances were quite lucky. You know, I didn't have an employer who said, that's it, you're sacked, or I didn't have an employer who said, well, I'm not going to pay you. You can have time off, but I'm not going to pay you. You know, all the stories I used to hear over here in the hospital waiting room. And I thought, in the grand scheme of things, I was super lucky. it's not nothing, you know, you live with it every day, but equally far, far worse things happen. Far worse thing happened. And my dad lived with Parkinson's for more than 10 years, and I know a lot about Parkinson's, and you know, I shouldn't get into a hierarchy of diseases and conditions, because that's not fair and that's not right either. But I think about my dad, and he had to live with and put up with far, far, far more than I have had to by losing a breast. I mean, far more. There's just no comparison. So I sort of keep that in the back of my mind as well.
Thank you, Jane. It's been such a pleasure for me to chat with you. It's time for me to step down, because we also have a number of questions that have been sent in from our students and alumni, and some questions from the audience. And I'm going to hand over at this point to my co-host, who's Tiana Dinard-Samuel, and she's Vice President Communities for Queen Mary Student Union. And she's also a recent Queen Mary graduate who's graduated with a BA in Hispanic Studies and Film Studies last summer. So Tiana, over to you, and thank you again, Jane.
Thank you, Rainbow. Thank you very much.
And Jane, can I just say it's been such a pleasure to hear more about your story, about your experiences this evening. And yeah, thanks again so much for coming to share with us this evening. And as a recent QM alumna and Vice President Communities especially, it's great to be invited here to talk to you. So as Rainbow said, we've had a lot of questions sent in. I think over 50 were submitted, so unfortunately we're not going to get through all 50 questions tonight, but we have a few selected, so I'll just jump straight in.
Yeah.
So the first question is, do you have any pearls of wisdom for any graduates who are looking to get into journalism?
That partly ties in with what I was saying earlier about local radio. Please try and tap up your local BBC radio station, assuming that you want to go into broadcast rather than print. But honestly, it is such, I can't say enough about what a great training ground it is. Try and find one in an area of the country that you know something about, so that if you end up in the newsroom, or you want to be in the newsroom, you know the patch and you know the area and that sort of thing. But that really is the best. I think that's the best thing. All of that said, I'm very conscious that I think of getting into the media from what it was like back in the day, 300 years ago, and of course I started in a world with no social media. You know, there was no such thing as Twitter. There, you know, all of these things that now drive so much of the industry simply didn't exist. So in one way, maybe that's better, because there's a lot more platforms like that to go and work for, maybe, and there's other places you can try and work which simply didn't exist when I was starting out. I mean, you went, if you wanted to be in broadcasting, you went to the BBC or you went to ITV. And that was it, or you worked in local newspapers, you know, and that was kind of it. It's so different now, and I can't sit here and pretend to know how you would go about working in those sort of platforms, or more of the social media world. It's not my world, and I don't want to pretend to, you know, be able to give advice that is just out of my frame of reference. But actually, the heartening thing is people still write to me today saying, how can I get a job at the BBC? Which is really lovely, actually, isn't it? When you think how many other options there are out there. And so my answer is always local radio. Pester them and be nice and be friendly and be keen and willing to learn, and you will love it. I don't see how you can't love it, actually. I think it's brilliant. And it provides such an important resource. And actually, local radio at the moment, I mean, here we are in a pandemic. This is, every time there's any sort of local or national crisis, local radio is just so important. Think how much you can learn about what's going on in your area in terms of the virus, in terms of vaccines, in terms of where to go. And I mean, it's just brilliant. It's just, local radio, I think, it's the business, really. And yeah, do it that way. You won't regret it.
Yeah, you definitely make it sound exciting. So that's really helpful. It's actually a question that kind of links on to some of the stuff you were just saying. So with the radical change in how news is consumed, what effect, if any, has that had on your job?
Yes, that really is all about social media, actually. And I'm thinking particularly when I'm sitting in the studio and a big story breaks, back in the, let's call it pre-Twitter days, for example. Other platforms are available, but you know what I mean by that. You know, we rely on the wire services, so Reuters, PA, Press Association Agency, all those sort of journalism agencies that are out there. By the way, previous questioner, also places you could try and work, by the way. We would rely on those, and the BBC has a very strict rule that you don't report a story until it's been reported on 2 wire services. So, you know, we know it's accurate, or we believe it's as accurate as it can be. Wow, I mean, my God, social media has changed all of that. So in fact, what happens now is, and I can think of one specific example, when they thought a bomb or something had gone off in Oxford Circus tube station in London. It turned out to be nothing, and in fact we never really fully found out what it was, but there was the tube station was evacuated. I think it was about 5 o'clock in the evening. I was on air, and so it was a solid hour of just doing that story. And again, it actually goes back to right where I started with Rainbow, about trying to keep calm and give context and not get hysterical, because people were saying on Twitter, it must be a bomb, I heard a bomb, it must be a bomb, you know, and that just feeds on itself. And you only need one person to say something on Twitter. They could be saying it maliciously to start a rumor, or they could genuinely believe that they have just tweeted something accurate. But either way, if it's wrong, and then that gets retweeted and retweeted, and before you know it, everyone thinks it's fact. And so I remember being on air saying, well, actually, this is what we think. This is what British Transport Police think. Yes, the station is closed. Yes, they've closed Regent Street, you know, but giving caveats, not saying it's nothing. Something's clearly happened. They've evacuated a tube station, but let's not get hysterical until we really know. And that's hard for the BBC and probably for all broadcasters, because I could see then people on Twitter saying, God, why is the BBC always so slow? It's ridiculous. What's the point in watching? You know, we can all read it on Twitter. And of course, on that particular instance, it turned out that lots and lots of people on Twitter were very wide of the mark. It hadn't been a bomb. No one had been hurt. And it transpired eventually we had reported it in an entirely accurate and sort of calm manner, but we are put under massive pressure by that sort of example, and so we have to really hold our nerve. I'm not saying it's entirely a force for bad. Sometimes it could be a force for good. You might get a steer as to the way a story is going from something that someone says on Twitter, but it's all about knowing who you follow, trusted sources, all those sort of issues that are so live today. It shows how things can get really taken out of context, and that has changed the job massively. It's always been a fast job as well. It's always been a busy job, but now it's like this, and you have to sort of hold your nerve sometimes and think just because 20 people are saying it on Twitter doesn't mean it's true.
Yeah, and we definitely live in this kind of instant gratification where we want everything now, we want the news now. So yeah, that must be a bit challenging. Shifting gears slightly, so this is kind of, you mentioned previously about the work you've done for diversity issues. So this question is, how do you try and leverage your privilege of platform to amplify underrepresented voices?
Did you say how do I leverage? Is that, sorry, you just dropped out.
Oh, sorry about that. How do you, or how would you?
How do I leverage my platform? Gosh, that is a really good and valid question. And as someone who you've already gathered gives quite long answers to things, I'm slightly worried that that's quite a long answer. But it's in the little day-to-day things, isn't it? I think it's in trying to look out for people or support people who you feel, I don't know, maybe just need that extra little bit of encouragement or help. I'm trying not to sound too pretentious about it, because it's sort of to do with I do try in a very, I mean, gosh, don't get me wrong, I try in a very small way to look out for people who I think should have a louder voice and perhaps don't. Now, how can I give you some coherent examples of that? I mean, again, I'm very conscious that from my own personal circumstance, I work in an environment where gay people are still in the minority, and particularly gay women, as we were discussing earlier on, and bi people, very much so, very hidden. And I hope that I do my bit as someone who, as the older I get, gets sort of more and more vocal about being gay, because I kind of think, well, somebody has to be, so I will. I hope I try and look out for people who maybe aren't quite that vocal, and in sort of nothing that you would know about, but sort of inside BBC internal events like we have, like any corporation has. You know, I try very hard to be quite bold about what more I think the corporation needs to do in this regard. And I do say things internally that I might not say publicly, so I can't necessarily say to you here, but I think there's no harm in being a vocal critic internally, because it's no good if we all just walk along going, oh yeah, it's fine really, isn't it? And I make myself sound like I'm some big sort of robust flag waving person, and it's quite funny because I'm not actually particularly robust at all, I don't think, and I don't have very sharp elbows at all, but in fact the living through breast cancer has changed that a little bit. I am definitely more ballsy since surviving breast cancer, and I think in this sphere particularly, because I think it just reminds you, it sounds really trite, but it reminds you that life is very, very short and we only get one chance. And I think, well, heck, I'm 51 and I've survived cancer. If I can't speak up for a 25-year-old person who is questioning their sexuality or feels like they don't belong in the news environment for whatever reason, that could be socioeconomic, that could be race, it could be all sorts of things, then really, Jane, what is the point of you being here? Because you've survived quite a lot in the last few years, actually. You know, your 30s were a struggle dealing with who you really were, and now in the last couple of years you had a big health struggle, and that has really focused my mind. Actually, I make that sound like, maybe I don't mean to make that sound like that was a conscious decision, because it wasn't, but I'm conscious that when I'm at internal events now, I feel a little bit more emboldened, and I'm sure that's a result of feeling really well and healthy now after something that could have been very, very big and scary. And it's interesting. I think that's great, actually, that something really positive like that has come out of it. So I try, maybe by the end of this conversation, I will be able to think of some really specific examples for you. The other thing is language, actually. Language, I'm very hot on language. I'm a very big grammar queen. So I go through and I correct everyone's grammar in scripts, and they kind of know that I do that, and they kind of laugh about me being the grammar queen. But in addition to that, I'll tell you, I'm very strong on language. I hate generalizations and anything that could upset anyone with language, because I think it's really, really important. So, for example, I will never, ever read out a cue to a story that says the elderly, the disabled, as if everyone over 70 is some big amorphous lump. I think that's so wrong, and I personally find that quite offensive. So I will always rewrite that to say elderly people, disabled people. You wouldn't write a cue that says the gays, would you? I mean, imagine how offensive that would be. And of course, I've never been presented with one that says that, and yet I do get presented with scripts that say the elderly. Well, do you know what? We're all going to be OAPs one day. I hope I am. I hope I'm going to get that far. And that's actually quite rude, I think. And that's not something that's peculiar to the BBC. I mean, the phrase the elderly is used in all forms of media and every newspaper and every broadcaster. It's become a sort of lazy turn of phrase. And things like that, I take a tiny amount of small pride in changing all of that, because I think I'm going to be 80 one day watching the news, and I won't want to be referred to as someone who's just one of the elderly. It's just rude, isn't it?
Yeah, and all these little things, they do add up. So yeah, it's definitely all the different types of influences that we have in everyday life, they do add up. So it's, yeah.
That's it, isn't it? That's it. And microaggressions, it's all part of that debate, isn't it? And I think, yeah, I think that's really, it's really important, yeah.
Definitely. So this one, you touched on coming out, or the kind of calling it coming out when it's not that big a deal. But what's your advice for anyone who is seeking an LGBT friendly employer?
Ooh, Oh, another good question. Oh my God. Well, that's so funny, isn't it? I have never thought about that other than in a practical sense. Obviously, there is the Stonewall list of LGBTQ plus friendly employers, which has been running for quite a few years now, hasn't it? And it's quite a rigorous process to assess which companies are doing best in that sphere. So I would totally look at that list. I would always look up the Stonewall list, and I think that's really useful. But if I was applying now, how would I find out? I wonder whether it's slightly easier to find out in as much as you can perhaps judge a company more through obviously their website, their social media activity, the causes they choose to support or champion. Maybe that sort of information is more readily available today than it would have been when I was joining the Beeb back in the day. And of course, when I joined the Beeb, I didn't know I was gay. I mean, I sort of did, but that's a whole other story. I wasn't remotely comfortable with who I was. So I was joining the BBC as a heterosexual person in those days. So would I have even thought about it? No, I wouldn't. It wouldn't have even occurred to me. So yeah, how do you find out about employers? I suppose ask around. Can you try and reach people who work for that company through contacting them through social media and say, what do they really like? I mean, companies are much more wise to that now, aren't they? And you've got to be open to all comers, because how are you going to attract the best talent? And that sort of thing just wasn't talked about when I joined. It just wasn't even a thing. And I'm glad it is now.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, yeah, you were mentioning before about how obviously times do change, and now there's more people feel comfortable coming out, being themselves. So it's something that companies should be kind of demonstrating that they support and are inclusive that way.
It should be a no-brainer for all the right reasons, that it's just the right thing to do, but also there are studies that show that profitable, I mean in the private sector I'm talking about, but companies are more profitable when they have a diverse workforce and a diverse board. I mean, you should be doing it because it's the right thing to do, but it's also empirically provable that it is better for the balance sheet. I mean, why would you? Groupthink is a terrible, terrible thing. And we've all experienced it, haven't we? We all have, wherever we go. And we've all, I'm sure in my youth I was guilty of it too. I'm quite sure I was, quite sure. And you have to really work quite hard to clamp down on that. But you can get left behind as a company if you engage in groupthink, because you don't see the competition coming up from behind. So
yeah, exactly. So this question is, what aspect of your, two-part question. So what aspect of your job motivates you, and what is the most difficult or challenging part of it?
What motivates me, what I love is that no 2 days are the same, which is something I still love today, actually. And I do consider that a great privilege. I consider it a real privilege going to work and not quite knowing what the day holds. I think that's really lovely and keeps you fresh. That is, I would qualify that by saying it's not quite true during the pandemic, sadly. So I think 1 year on, very nearly 1 year on, we're all starting to get a bit ratty now in the newsroom, and I include myself in that very much, because a job that has always been varied and different and unusual every day, even within news, can take on a form of repetition, and that's how the whole country is living, the whole world is living at the moment. So if we exclude the pandemic period from that answer, that is what I would say. It's a little more challenging at the moment, it's fair to say. Oh God, sorry, what was the second part?
Well, yeah, the second part was what is challenging or difficult. So yes. I guess apart from the pandemic.
Coronavirus. What's challenging right now is obviously not being able to get my hair cut. Hashtag first world problems, but in my job, oh my God, it's a nightmare. I cannot tell you. I have very, very curly hair as well, so I have to straighten it every day for a start. My God, that's tedious. And it's a nightmare. Now that it's so long, I mean, obviously first world problems, obviously, but I am so losing the will to live with it. I cannot tell you. And I am very conscious. If any of my colleagues were watching this broadcast, I would really just kind of like to apologize for how I've been for the last 2 weeks, because I have been so grumpy about my hair. and about the fact that we have not had any makeup artists working since last March, as anyone who's been watching the news will have realised. Sadly, they come in the close contact category of people, so hairdressers aren't working, makeup artists aren't working. And in fact, even when the hairdressers did reopen a little bit last year, we did not have makeup artists at the BBC, and they cannot come back too soon. I am so over doing my own makeup, and again, I appreciate that sounds like first world problems, but to bring a bit of levity into all of this, it's just become, I've done it for a whole year, and it's so stressful because you go on air every day just feeling a bit rubbish about yourself, actually, and that's a bit depressing, and B, it's really distracting from the journalism, because we're there to do interviews and tell stories and write interesting scripts, and I do not want to be spending my time thinking, oh my God, am I really shiny? Which is what you do, because I'm on air for 3 hours at a time. You know, I do the 1 o'clock news and then I stay on air till 4 o'clock. I mean, you know, I've really sort of hit the wall with it, as you can tell, the last couple of weeks. I don't know. I feel like, no, I was going to say, I feel like paying a makeup artist cash in hand and breaking the rules and bringing one in. Obviously, I won't do that, people. It's a joke, but it's a joke. But I would give anything for one of our lovely, lovely makeup artists to be back working with us right now. Yeah. So that's my greatest challenge at the moment. I will probably cry the first time they do my makeup again, and then they'll just have to redo it. I'll be in tears.
Oh, no, that's actually really interesting. I hadn't thought about that side of things. Yeah, so thanks for sharing. I think we have time for a couple more questions. So this one is, interesting question. How do you envision the future of journalism to look, particularly given the current issues in the field faces in relation to the surge in fake news disseminated by social media? So we've kind of talked a bit about this, but yeah, how do you envisage the future to look?
You see, this is, it is something I do get asked occasionally. And do you know what? I should have just sat down and really thought through what my answer to that question would be, because I totally understand why everyone asks. And I think I wish I had a crystal ball, and I wish I knew where it was going. It does scare me. I don't mean to sound like some old fuddy-duddy. I mean, it does scare me because having truthful, impartial, balanced news is so important for democracy. I mean, we all know that, don't we? And it does frighten me. And we've seen, haven't we, in the last few years in the US, for example, how untruths can be said, and then people start thinking they're true, and then they take on a life of their own. I mean, it's just, and not just in America. I mean, it's, how do we get young people, how do we get people of my niece's ages to, they don't have to watch the news, they don't have to watch in the sort of thing I do necessarily, but they need to read quality news somewhere. They need to be reading a broadsheet newspaper to make sure they're getting decent, impartial information. And how do we make that happen when you can personalize everything on your phone, and you can say, oh, I only want to read sports news and entertainment news. Now, there's nothing wrong with sport or entertainment. I read sport and entertainment news, but I read lots of other things too, and I can't imagine a world where I don't. And that really scares me, and I don't know what we're going to do about it. I have to just hope that ultimately there are enough good people out there who will sort of fight the good fight. The next generation will realize that there'll be a turn. You know, we'll go through all this terrible stuff and all the awful stuff we're going through now about, I mean, I even hate the phrase fake news. I don't even want to use it. It's so horrible. But, you know, lies. I don't want people to tell lies on social media and for people to think it's true. It doesn't benefit anybody. On conspiracy theories, all that sort of thing. And I hope that as a society, because maybe the internet is still relatively new, we're going through a terrible phase where we almost have to go through these bad experiences, and bad things have to happen, and untruths have to be said, until eventually the next generation, which I guess is my niece's generation, because they're quite young, they're sort of 12 and 9, maybe that generation, by the time they get to sort of university age and beyond, they will have a lot more common sense about them, and there will just be a groundswell that says, oh my God, look what the last lot did. We can't have that. We can't have all this fake news being disseminated everywhere. And somehow somehow the system will reset itself, and you will never get rid of it entirely, but that, you know, sense will prevail. I really just have to hope that, actually, because I don't know from a technical perspective. I'm not technically minded enough to know how you could stamp it out any other way, really. I just hope good decency will prevail, good people will prevail.
Yeah, social media is a crazy thing where on one hand it's so useful and great, but it can be really dangerous. And I saw something about like these fake like videos, so now people can like make fake videos that look realistic. So it's crazy. It's a bit dangerous, but yeah, hopefully, like you said, with people who want the truth. And
yeah. Educating people, actually we should be doing something in schools to properly educate students about how, when you look at a website or whatever, how you make your own judgments about what is true. You know, check the date on it. Is it up to date? Who is saying this? You know, almost civic lessons to get youngsters, really young people, because you're on your phone so young now, to really learn how to navigate it, and so that you know, have the wherewithal yourself to sort the wheat from the chaff, really. That's got to, I guess, start in schools, really.
Definitely. Cool. I'm going to end us on a bit of a fun, lighthearted question. Bring it back, because obviously you are an alumna of Queen Mary. So first of all, did you enjoy your time at Queen Mary? Do you have like a funny anecdote from your time here that you'd like to share?
I did really enjoy my time. I loved living in International Hall. I'm sorry, I know that's not offending any Queen Mary types, because obviously that's an intercollegiate hall. It's not specifically a Queen Mary hall, but it was brilliant, and there were lots of Queen Mary people there, and it was just magic, absolute magic. One of the happiest times of my life, it really was. I loved it. I obviously wish I had worked harder. I am a very, very passionate theatre goer. I love the theatre, so I'm really struggling in the pandemic. And I spent a huge amount of time during the 3 years of my degree using student standbys, which they probably still have, just this brilliant scheme where you could queue up at a theatre, and from an hour before curtain up, they would sell any unsold tickets to students for, well, it was a £5 in those days, £5 in those days. And I just thought this was just heaven. I thought I just died and gone to heaven. And I spent an awful lot of time at the theatre, which would probably have been fine if I'd been reading English. And I fear that my little theatre addiction, which is still with me today, is the reason that I, to my great shame, only came out with a 2-2, because I was just having too much fun meeting new people, meeting friends, and going to the theatre. I came from a very, very small town in Sussex, and I always wanted the big city experience, and London University was my first choice on my form, because I desperately wanted to be in a big city. All my university choices, second, third, fourth choice, they were all big cities, because I wanted to be in a city. And I loved it. And I think because I'd, you know, had a very sort of small life growing up in a small place, I really wanted to love London in every way I could, and which is kind of astonishing, isn't it, that I didn't realize I was gay? I mean, how did that happen? Seriously, it's one of my biggest questions in life. How could I be in London and not work that out? But anyway, that's a whole other conversation for a different hour and a half. But yes, I loved it, and I was very happy, and I was very shocked and delighted when I was asked to be offered the chance to be an honorary fellow. I didn't expect that at all, so that was really, really lovely.
Great, yeah. And also, I think, you know, if you're in London for uni, obviously not during a pandemic, you would obviously be making the most of like the theatre, everything London has to offer. I was the same as you. I only wanted to go to big cities for university, so completely get that. Cool. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to hand back over to Rainbow to kind of close us up.
Thank you ever so much.
Thank you ever so much, Tiana, for asking questions from our audience, and thank you so much to our audience for joining us from all around the world. But above all else, I'd like to extend my warmest thanks to Jane for being our guest this evening. You've been absolutely amazing. Sorry, that's my 4-year-old in the background who doesn't want to go to bed. You've been amazing. You have been so open with us and so candid and so much fun. I've really enjoyed listening to you for the last hour and a half, and I imagine our audience has been as well. And I would like to thank the Alumni Angles team for organising this event. Please watch out for future events that they organise. May they all be as enjoyable as this one. So thank you again so much for joining us, Jane.
Thank you very much. Thank you.